Hello, I'm Stuart Craner, co-founder of Thinkers50 and director of the Business Ecosystem Alliance. Welcome to our fourth webinar of thoughts and opinions during the session. And I'm delighted that today's session features three people with very distinctive perspectives on the organizational world. This session is led by Jeffrey Kuhn. Jeff is an executive advisor and educator focused on enterprise strategy, leadership, and transformation in the digital age. His work centers on helping senior business leaders develop the capacity to think and lead strategically in dynamic market environments undergoing profound change. Probably sounds familiar. Jeff has served on the faculty of Columbia Business School and has an exciting book under development that explores the intersection of organizational dynamism, growth, and vitality through the prism of strategic leadership. Thank you for taking the lead, Jeff, and I will leave you to introduce today's subject and our guests.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you, Stuart, for the kind introduction, and thank you also for hosting today's event. And hello, everybody. Hope you had a fantastic weekend. It's really great to be with you today. So we have an exciting discussion plan for you that explores the concept of open organizational strategies and structures. But before we jump in, I'd like to introduce our two esteemed experts, Dr. Annika Steiber and Dr. Mark Greeven. Hello. Annika is an amazing thinker, unbelievable friend and colleague. She's based in Silicon Valley. She's a professor at Menlo College. She's also director of the Rende Center in Silicon Valley. She's a deep expert in dynamic capabilities in the digital age. She advises executive teams around the world, and a very prolific author. I thought it was 4 books, but it's actually 10, working on her 11th. And she also writes numerous monographs and articles. She serves and or has served on a number of boards. And in a prior life was a senior executive. So as we say in the academy, she has real world experience, which is a good thing. Mark is also an amazing thinker, and he divides his time between Switzerland, Dubai, and Singapore. So he's an international man of mystery, as they say. Great friend, great colleague. Glad to have you today, Mark. He is a professor of innovation and strategy at IMD. He's a Thinkers50 ranked expert in competitive dynamics in the digital age. He's Dutch-born, probably speaks 20 languages, but he is fluent in Mandarin, and he has extensive experience, lived in China. He has extensive experience researching, teaching, advising Chinese business leaders. So he's fascinated by China. He's a prolific author as well. He's written numerous books, articles, and case studies. And Annika and Mark are both founding members of the Business Ecosystem Alliance, which is hosting this event for today. So as you can see, we're in very capable hands with our webinar. But I'd like to take a minute just to set some context, and then I'll hand it over to our panelists. So before we jump in, I thought it'd be a good idea to take a minute and briefly describe what we mean by the closed organizational construct as a point of comparison before we explore open strategy. So bear with me for a minute. So if you think in your mind's eye, the closed organizational construct is really one of the defining features of the 20th century industrial capitalism. So in your mind's eye, think of this colossal, vertically integrated, asset-intensive business of the last century. But most importantly, under this paradigm, value is presumed to be created inside the organization, so within the walls of the enterprise, with resources either owned and or controlled by the enterprise. So think of Ford. Ford actually were at a point where they had a banana tree. They had a plantation in Brazil. So vertical integration and amassing of resources. So value is presumed to be created within the enterprise and then pushed out to the market for consumption. So in other words, there's a clear line of demarcation between value creation and consumption. That's a very important consideration. So producers held the balance of power. Consumers had limited information and choices. And under this paradigm, there's no such thing as co-creation of value like we have in today's world. So as you can see, it's a much different paradigm from today's organizational ethos. And so why don't we now, so that's closed, and why don't we turn our attention to open strategies, and we'll jump in and hear from our experts. So Annika and Mark, are you ready?
All good.
All right, let's bring it on. Okay, Annika. A couple years ago at a virtual conference, I think it was September 2020, you were speaking and I was in the audience, and you had a you had a slide that really caught my attention, and I think the header was the defining features of the 21st century enterprise. And you had three circles. The first one was open, the other one was purpose-driven, and the third one was people-centric, if I recall. And as I listened to you speak, you really caught my attention with the concept of organizational openness. I could tell you've done a lot of research in this area over many, many years. So I'm curious, when did the concept of openness catch your attention? And how do you define or describe it? What's it look like? What is this thing called openness?
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for the very kind introduction. So I think the concept that catch my attention in around 2010. I was then getting a larger research project, and we started to look at Swedish large firms and how they started to organize differently for accelerated innovation. And then I compared that to activities that were happening in Silicon Valley and Chinese firms as well. So I saw that this phenomena was spread all over, and also in other countries of Europe, of course. At that point in time, I called that and I referred it to open innovation, Jesper's open innovation concept that he introduced in 2003. And when we look closer, and after now 11 years of research, we have developed and identified 8 different models for how you can actually work with open strategies and open enterprises. And even if we were focused on innovation at the beginning, that has also evolved over time. And I think important here to remember and maybe pinpoint is also that it's not just to access innovation from outside, but it's in the open innovation concept is also inside out opportunities. That is to actually put ideas and innovation that you as an organization might have developed out on the market. So it's both inside out and outside in. So it's 2 different dimensions.
Right. Okay, excellent. So quite a bit of rigor, quite a bit of thought over many, many years to arrive at this concept of openness. Mark, when did the concept of openness catch your attention?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I mean, it caught my attention quite in a quite specific environment and quite specific setting, and it was around 2005, I think, which was one of the times that I went to China at that time to study for part of my PhD work on innovation, and I got to meet a couple of folks at Alibaba. You can imagine which people, and I was very lucky to also be able to meet Mr. Ma. And I remember that I asked a couple of the friends there. I said, this is all really cool. Tell me about your company. And then they looked at me like, what do you mean, a company? I said, okay. So maybe I call you a group or a platform. And then they were like, yeah, but we have multiple platforms, right? So and we're also not really a group, because that sounds kind of like unrelated and diversified. So I said, okay. I give up. So how do you see yourselves? And then they actually said, well, we see ourselves as an economy. And then I thought about it. My first response was like, that's pretty arrogant, right? I mean, it's very ambitious. It's also a little bit arrogant, right? And then I thought about it. But one of the major features of an economy, of course, is that, it cuts across all kinds of sectors, different locations. It's a very open concept of thinking about the business, right? They could have said, I'm going to be the best retailer in the world or so, or the best financial service provider. They didn't. So I thought that was really interesting. And from that point on, I started to look at companies like Alibaba, but other companies in China, but also companies in other parts of the world, Southeast Asia, Middle East, Europe, US, where we find similar concepts of being a bit boundaryless, without boundaries. And for me, I think that was one of the triggers to think about the topic of ecosystems, because I think the nature of an ecosystem is that it has open boundaries. It's an open way of organizing.
Right.
I think for me that was where the interest came from originally.
Right. To really frame your organization as an economy versus a conglomerate or a group or a set of SBUs, what have you, which is very traditional thinking. Right. So what are various types or forms of open strategies and structures? What are organizations doing? Of course, there's ecosystems, but what else?
So go ahead.
So, if there are different forms, yes. So my focus has specifically been with how large firms are working with startups. And so in our world, there are, as I said, 8 different models, but those are actually applicable also for how to work with customers or research institutes or suppliers. And I think you can use the same models for different kind of stakeholders. One is, of course, to acquire it, right? To make it part of your own vertical chain. And on the other opposite, it would be to do a pure commercial collaboration, which we call co-creation or even co-location strategy, where you don't actually have even plans and projects. You just have them to be located very close to you. Many companies in life science industry are doing that, and they are looking for this serendipity opportunities. Then you have the corporate programs, the corporate incubator programs, the accelerator programs, and also something that we identified that we called startup programs. So Google's startup programs or Microsoft startup program and platforms are also a model here. So all in all, and I forgot to mention corporate venturing, of course. So all those are the 8 different models, and we cluster them based on, do they take equity of the startup or not, and is it from from outside in, or is it inside out? So is it my own idea that I want to put on the market by creating a new business? Or is it that I find something from outside and bring it in?
Right. So ecosystems, platforms, user communities, crowdfunding, open innovation. Is that the spectrum of open strategies?
Yes.
Those sorts of things? Venturing?
Yes, I didn't mention those words, but they are under one of those concepts. A co-creation, for example, could be crowdsourcing.
Right. And established firms are using these as well, which is the focus of our conversation today. So let's move to the next point here. So let me just briefly set this up here. So if you think of Uber and Airbnb, well-known platforms, they were essentially born open, right? They're open from birth. They weren't closed and had to open. They were open from birth because their success is really based on pulling this vast ecosystem or constellation of users to the platform. So hosts and guests, drivers and riders, really to drive positive network effects. So the more people who join the platform, that increases the value of the firm. So obviously that's one model here. But today we want to zero in on firms that were born in the 20th century. So your established, more conventional firms. And Mark, I am interested from your vantage point, how is this concept of openness? So by that we mean collaborating and creating value with entities outside the enterprise, taking root in established firms that were born in the 20th century, so prior to the digital age. Is there such a thing as an open 1.0 and an open 2.0? And how has this idea taken root and evolved over the last 2 decades?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's a really important question, right? Because, let's be honest, the majority of companies, the companies that we work with are not just 10 years, 20 years old, right? They're born in the 20th century and they see the potential of leveraging partners, resources, capabilities from outside of their firm's boundaries. So that topic of leveraging open strategies, I think, is not a new topic. It's a topic that probably started with companies realizing, hey, we need to innovate faster, more relevant. We may not have all the answers, and there's lots and lots of great scientists, startups, other companies out there. And I think that gave rise to this whole open innovation that Annika referred to earlier, open innovation movement. And I think it's safe to say that it's kind of like open 1.0. And a company that I always think about when I think about open innovation, and that later evolved into a more ecosystem thinking, is a company from the Netherlands, actually, called DSM. So DSM is originally it was a mining company, the Dutch state mines, but it became a chemicals company, specialty chemicals company, and actually today is a life sciences business. And what they have done very, very cleverly since at least the 1990s is leveraging open innovation to help them to innovate. And that was, I think, up until maybe the last 10, 15 years, that was the case, right? Finding innovation sources, ideas, and then pull them into the funnel of innovation. But what we also have seen with them, especially in the last 10, 15 years or so, is that they said, well, can we not only just pull in ideas, but can we actually, together with our partners, co-create our innovation pipeline? And this is something that they have done very successfully, for instance, with the business of nutrition, right? Where they basically say, let's partner with lots of companies that know about this business. It's a new business for us. Let's invest. Let's acquire some businesses. And then when we put all of these things together, perhaps this becomes a new growth engine. And actually, that's what it became. And you've probably seen that about a year ago, they actually sold off one of their previous business focus areas in engineering plastics. So very, very successful in terms of embracing, let's say, an open innovation 1.0, maybe 20, 30 years ago, but also evolving this open strategy towards leveraging an ecosystem for innovation in the last decade.
So today in Open 2.0, so to speak, we have more market-facing open strategies and structures. And it sounds like the defining theme is really this co-creation of value with resources and entities outside the enterprise. Yeah. Annika, can you build on those ideas? What have you seen in terms of the evolution?
Yeah, no, I agree with Mark. It's fascinating to listen to because we have sort of come from a little bit different parts of the world and seen the same thing. So I definitely, for me, the phase one was all about, innovation and R&D. And I think also Shepard very focused on that. And then we moved over the time, we moved to sort of a phase two, where it's more about the share of customer needs and maximizing customer experience and be able to keep a lifelong customer, where you create ecosystem also towards the customer. So that is a pretty new phenomenon, and I think Hire in China is the company I know mostly about, among the Chinese companies that have been doing that a lot. But I also did research on co-creation. I wrote a specific piece of research paper on co-creation, and it all seemed to started, the natural part was that it was co-creation with the customer. That was early on, very early on. And later, they started to co-create together with companies like startups, which is also a newer phenomenon.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. So to both of you, I'd really like to get my head around the strategic drivers of open strategy. So meaning, why would an established conventional firm, let's say like John Deere or Caterpillar or what have you, deploy open strategy? So what are the business benefits both for the organization and for customers? And how is openness a source of competitive advantage? Let's start with Mark.
Yeah, so this is the critical question, right? And if an open strategy involves, us, the company, with our partners, with our customers, obviously it needs to create benefits for everybody involved. So I think that's a very important starting point. I think the assumption behind an open strategy or an open way of organizing is that we believe that we can create a better future, a more relevant future for our customers, our complementers, our partners, than together, than we do it alone, right? So there is this inherent belief that there is a number of problems in the world that companies or organizations try to solve that are just better solved doing it together. And I think that's, for me, one of the three reasons why companies are considering open strategies. So one is really to be relevant, right? It's actually to be relevant in the future. I think the second reason, it came up a couple of times before, but it is about speed. It is about being quick enough to respond to changing needs in the market, changing regulatory requirements, all kinds of competitive moves, responsiveness in the sense of being quick enough to to catch up with with the world. I think that's the second driver I always like to emphasize. And the third one, and it also starts with an R, is resilience. The great thing about working together is it actually builds in resilience in the system of the way we organize. And we've seen that. We've seen that with the company that Annika mentioned, Hire. Hire has been tremendously resistant and resilient, even during difficult times. And part of that is because, well, they have organized themselves in this open way that enabled them to be more resilient.
Yeah, we'll speak about Hire in a minute, but early on they conceptualized the firm as the sea. So constant influx of new water flowing of ideas that energize the firm and rejuvenate it. Annika, what do you view as the competitive drivers of the openness? And what's different about competing against an open firm versus a closed firm?
Thank you for asking. It's a highly relevant question. So if we go back to what I used early on, and Cesar's sort of was introducing his book in 2003. He pinpoint things like there is a reduced product life cycle, right? So the product life cycle time is reduced. So there is a time aspect. You need to get stuff out more frequently and innovate more frequently. And there's a need to share cost. And also he pinpoint like there is an increased number of experts outside of the firm due to increased mobility of people and also an increased access of capital. So it's easy to so for example, leave your company and start a startup. What I found in my own research is that companies, those large companies, specifically in not born with those new emerging technologies, they are facing an increased complexity of products. It's the old technology that they know really well, like mechanical engineering and physics and those kind of things. But then there are new technology areas that they actually don't know very well. And they need to collaborate in order to manage that increased complexity. Another is, of course, related to that lack of competence. They might not have the top AI engineers, right, in the firm, and they need to collaborate. Another reason might be that they have a lack of ecosystem. I mean, we are talking about ecosystem, but let's face it, with new emerging technologies, for every new emerging technology, there is an ecosystem built up around the new technology to sort of create commercial opportunities around that technology. And those large firms might not be part of those ecosystem. And by collaborating with certain parties of those new ecosystem, they become part of them. So it's almost like an entry to a market, which is super important for them. And then, of course, there's a demanding customers, and it's increasingly demanding customers. They want to customize product. They want it, maybe daily support, daily access to the company. And it might not be possible to do this all alone as a single company, right? To cover all those needs and make the customer happy daily. So there are a number of reasons, and you asked me for what is then competitive sort of advantage and how does it change the competition? It changed the competition tremendously, because I mean, if you think about what the platform economy have been doing, my firm belief is if you are successful building an ecosystem, the entry barrier into the industry is increasingly, becoming stronger. It's very hard to enter an industry where it's a super strong ecosystem already with parties. You might enter as an ecosystem party if you are a true value contributor but you might also not be welcome into that ecosystem. And what do you do then? Starting your own ecosystem? It takes time to build an ecosystem. And companies like that, like Google and companies here in Silicon Valley, they understood that way back, right? So I think it's not only a competitive advantage, it's changing the industry structure as well.
Okay, so Mark had 3 R's, and I actually counted 5 C's with you, Annika, so pretty good here. So I heard increase, this is good, increase complexity, collaboration with partners outside the enterprise, co-opetition, co-creation of value, customization, the ability to pull in different capabilities as needed, more on a modular basis. And the biggie, though, is co-creation of value here. And I'm also sensing that, when we talk about how do you compete against an open enterprise, it's a new type of defensive perimeter. So it actually creates a barrier to entry as well. It's a digital defensive perimeter, but nonetheless, it's still a perimeter. So that goes back to industrial era thinking around building a moat around your business. In this case, it's a digital moat. So good stuff. So let's talk about the journey. What's the journey look like? So let's say you're a conventional firm. You were born in 1950, pre-digital era, more of a closed construct, not invented here. Everything is built in-house, pushed out to the market. What does it look like when an organization shifts or evolves from this closed to open orientation? It'd be great if you could paint the picture for participants. So what needs to change in terms of culture, metrics, technology, organizational design, processes, those sorts of things? So Mark, why don't you start out?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, it's a great question. It's also a very, very tricky question, right? Because it depends really on the industry. It depends on where the companies are located, what they're trying to do. Ultimately, it depends what customers they're trying to serve. I always like to think about it in the following way. I think when we are embarking on a journey of transforming into an ecosystem, I think we always have to understand there is a strategic component to this, right? So it needs to help us to grow and achieve a certain purpose of the organization. There needs to be an organizational component, which means changing the way that we organize the processes, but also the reward structures. And suddenly people in the organization need to work with people outside of their own organization, even outside of their own industry. And there is an unmistakably digital component to this, right? So I think when companies come to us and they say like we're considering to build an ecosystem around a product or a value proposition, and we always say let's look at it from these 3 different perspectives to see where, and also to see where to start, right? So to answer your question more bluntly, and I'm from the Netherlands, right? So I can do that. It does really start with around what are we building an ecosystem, right? For what purpose? I mean, honestly, there's lots of reasons to build an ecosystem. There's more reasons not to build an ecosystem. So I think the first question is, who are we trying to serve? In what way, and then we start to think about all the other features, the strategic implications, the organizational implications, the digital implications. But for me, it starts a bit with for whom, for what purpose, and that's just a good starting point, I think.
So start with the strategic drivers, the strategic value proposition, et cetera, and then what kind of organization or systems do we need to design? How's our organization need to evolve? Annika, what's your experience with organizations going from a closed to an open orientation? What needs to change on the inside?
So my experience is that they don't even start with a strategy. It's more of I don't know, a catch-up effect, that they are funded by the government to do an initiative in this field, or they are doing it to change their own culture or an employer branding initiative. So many, they do the technical change and set up an initiative like this, but it's actually not very aligned, very embedded in the strategy. But which is, of course, it's hard to, they have to go up the value chain and go, towards a strategy at the end to make this fully impactful, right? But I would also like to build on what Mark said. I would say that company need to start before strategy. My framework that I work with more and more lately is actually a framework from Edgar Schein and Peter Schein on corporate culture, because I'm a true believer now, more than I was only half a year ago, that any transformation is nothing else than a culture transformation. And if you use Edgar Schein's framework, where he discussed that it's the underlying assumptions and the exposed values and the artifacts, which is the technical sort of system of your organization. If you start with strategy, but not have change underlying assumptions, I don't think you will fly. The underlying assumption is number one. If you don't believe that this is the way forward, this is the way you are going to manage the firm in innovation, reaching your customers, and so on, it will not reach the drawing board and the strategy, the board of director room or the executive room and the strategy document, right? So you need to start there. And how will that happen? That usually happens by they are triggered. They see a competitor is doing a fantastic performance. They don't really understand why. When they start to understand that, oh my God, this company is using something that they never use. They work in a different way. They start to maybe understand that this might be something. It could also be a trigger from the board saying that you have to do this, right? Convince board members. But and it could be a new CEO coming in with a whole different perspective. I've seen that over and over again, taking over CEO role, and just being totally convinced. Janssen is that, for example. Janssen is a Johnson & Johnson company. They had a new CEO coming in. We're like, okay, it's open innovation first from now on. Totally convinced that this is the way we're doing things from now on. So I would do, really start with trying to get those assumptions, the sort of underlying assumptions, beliefs that is never spoken about among the top leadership, and then start question those and change those beliefs, and then we can, of course, start doing the strategy and then change the technical system, the artifacts.
So I'm hearing a couple things here. First off, there's some sort of trigger events needed to even begin on this journey from closed to open. Typically, that could be competitive dynamics. So out in the marketplace, it could be a board member exerting influence or a new CEO who wants to make this transition. So trigger events are first thing. Second thing I'm sensing, we'll dig in on this leadership dimension in a second here, but it sounds like there's a profound paradigmatic shift required to make this journey from closed to open. It's a totally different business worldview, totally different orientation to the market, new ways of creating value with customers, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious, how does this open orientation recast the role of senior leaders, and how is leading an open enterprise different from a conventional closed firm? What sort of paradigmatic level shifts are required? So Mark, why don't you lead off?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, this is a really fundamental question, and in the end of the day, it's a transformation. It's a transformation of people, and the leaders play a very big role in guiding that transformation, right? And I think there's a couple of things that come to mind. So one of the consequences of open ways of organizing and strategizing is that you're going to introduce more uncertainty rather than less, right? Because you're going to have lots and lots of things that you don't know. So what we see with leaders in successful ecosystem businesses is that they're really good at managing this tension between being the expert on the one hand and knowing everything and having experience on the one hand, and on the other hand being the one that says, I don't really know the answer, but I know how we can find this out, and you'll figure it out, and being that balancing act. I think being in a way the master of the unknown, while sometimes still being the one that is the person to go to with experience, and so on. So I think that's And that's for me is one really important feature of a leader in in this new ecosystem age, if you like. It's not necessarily being 100% comfortable with uncertainty. I think it's a balancing act. It's a tension between the predictable and the unpredictable. I think the second thing is, for me, it's really about humility of leadership, in the sense of I have an experience in an industry, in an organization, and that is useful, but I need to connect that experience to a lot of other industries, because I'm going to be probably operating an ecosystem that crosses across different industries and sectors, and I need to be comfortable with managing that that without thinking in terms of boundaries. And so the more a leader stops to think in terms of boundaries and this is how it was done, the more he or she becomes open to thinking and helping and enabling an ecosystem. Now, and the third, and for me the last one, I think probably one of the most important ones, is it's because an ecosystem's nature and an open organization's nature is very fuzzy, right? There is no clear direction, no clear boundary. You cannot end up with an organization that is not fulfilling its purpose and its promise, right? And it's more important in this new world of open organizing that the leader is very clear about what is the purpose of my organization, and how do the actions that I enable in my teams enable us to reach that purpose. Because without that purpose, there's not going to be a very clear strategy document with the 5 things to do. It's actually really difficult if I need to manage an organization that connects to other organizations that have other purposes and other objectives and other targets. So I think it becomes, the leader really has to become sort of a beacon of, this is why we're doing all of this. This is the purpose of our organization, and being able to, communicate that, being able to show that, and to lead through purpose, I think is going to be really important. Otherwise, it's easy to get lost, right? It's easy to get lost in an ecosystem or in an open organization.
Right.
So for me, those are 3 things.
Yeah, so I just jotted down the headlines here. So curiosity and openness, element of humility, so the not knowing model, I think is very important. And also just being boundaryless by nature, like you described, Jack Ma and Alibaba, operating boundaryless with a wide angle lens, so to speak. And then also, this is a very fuzzy concept, when you try and explain an ecosystem or this or that. So it's important then to be clearly, to be anchored in who you are as a leader, and organizationally to be clear on your purpose, so be purpose driven. And a lot of times you have to kind of reconcile different purposes with your ecosystem partners, et cetera, et cetera. So a reconciliation process as well. So Annika, how does what we're talking about today, leading an open enterprise, how does it recast our very notion of senior level leaders?
I would say it's impacting senior leaders, in a way where it's more challenging, I would say, than the old paradigm. I mean, in the old paradigm, it was enough to have, internal control and, look up quality problems or solve, issues within. Now with an ecosystem is per default, catching untapped opportunities, right? And keeping your customers as maybe lifetime customers. So a senior leader need to really, I think, understand those untapped opportunities in a much better way than maybe before, and need to be more strategic than ever and be more long term. And then, of course, do that kind of mapping. Okay, who are the partners that we should collaborate with, and then get that kind of partnership working, because we haven't discussed that. But I mean, it's easy to talk about an ecosystem, but if you go back to the research theory about transaction cost and those things, you need to keep that really down, because if you're building up an ecosystem with a lot of partners, you cannot spend more and more time on admin and transaction, right? So and here we have the new emergent technology. like big data and AI and blockchain specifically, that can enable us and help us to actually be, working this new way and still efficiently and with a low cost, unit
Right.
cost of communication and for transactions. But it's a it's a new way of thinking. It's a new way of believing that you don't have to have control of everything. You have to let go of control. I think you have to become more a McGregor why theory person.
Right.
Trust people, trust partners, and then you have to again get this sort of technical system to work, the infrastructure to work, to get a pretty low communication unit cost and transaction cost in this new ecosystem. And I hear commonly problems among beginners using this kind of way of working. It's usually legal aspect. How will we protect our IP? Okay, we don't have documents. The legal department is coming in and they are going to do some kind of contract between parties, and it takes 6 months to do a contract with one party. All those things need to be set, standardized, and become super efficient, right? Because you cannot have that transaction cost. So it's a step to work to this new on this. It takes years to do that.
So closed to open, control to letting go, mechanistic thinking to more ecological forms of thinking, generative modes of leadership. That's what I'm hearing as our themes here. So with that in mind, why don't we speak? We both mentioned you both mentioned hire a minute ago. So let's talk about hire. I'm interested in, from your vantage point, it's my sense all three of us have visited China, visited hire, and conducted extensive research there. So we share that in common here. And so I personally view hire at the vanguard of a lot of these things. So ecosystem-based business, platforms, crowdfunding, et cetera, et cetera. So what do you see in hire? Let's just paint a very concrete picture for participants here. What puts them at the leading edge of openness? What unique culture and capabilities do they have as an organization?
Mark,
why don't you go?
Okay, sure. So that's it's a very difficult question to answer in 2 sentences. So I think for me the key word for me here is entrepreneurialism. And so what makes hire a very interesting case to look at from an open organization point of view is that they manage to basically see and reinvent themselves as a platform for entrepreneurs. And I think that's a very, very powerful logic. So there's almost no distinction between the company and what is sort of outside of the company, right? It is the almost the true definition of an open boundary or a boundaryless organization. And I think that's, for me, one of the key elements. It's very much driven by an entrepreneurial drive that makes it a very interesting culture. It makes it a very competitive culture, I believe. But it also is one of the drivers of their open organization strategy. So there's lots and lots of other things, but for me, keyword is fostering entrepreneurship in this new way of organizing. Right.
So entrepreneurship, and we should add that hire is a $40 billion enterprise. Global.
Exactly.
Yeah, and traditionally in the white goods industry, now they're in smart home solutions, but the market leader in home appliances, large, medium, and full size appliances, consumer electronics, et cetera, but extensive use of open strategies, open innovation, user communities that have millions and millions, social commerce networks, all sorts of things. So, Annika, we've both studied hire. We've been there at the hire events in Shanghai and Qingdao and what have you. So, what do you see? What unique capabilities and culture does hire have in terms of being an open enterprise?
So I would like to answer that by mentioning a number of objectives that large firm might have to become open. If we talk about, one is just reaching new markets or reach new businesses, be able to new businesses and actually will disrupt themselves. if that is one objective, the other objective is, more efficient product development, and that is more close to your core business today. And then a third objective might be to take just a bigger share of the customer, create a lifelong customer. Hire have been doing all those three. They have actually different solutions. They have different open solutions for all three. And if we start with the first one, entering new emerging markets and secure, become resilient and secure sort of the future hire, they have their entrepreneurial platform with 4,000 sort of project startups going on right now. Everything from idea up to an IPO companies, IPO-based companies. And they funnel those really efficiently up, the funnel up towards an IPO. And then increase the product development efficiency. They have Hope. They have the platform Hope, which it's definitely helping all the R&Ds functions within Hire. And then regarding the customer, they're working with those ecosystem micro communities, and where they have developed these ecosystem micro community contracts to get the transaction costs down that I mentioned before. So they are working on all three flanks right now with unique solutions. And depending on what you're interested in, I think, there is more or less a case study of each of those three.
Okay, so we have a few more minutes to go, so I think we should start to wrap here. So if you could give one bit of advice, what's the most important thing you would share with the board or executive team about open strategies? Mark, what would that be? What's the most important bit of advice you could provide?
Most important bit of advice here is don't build an ecosystem around everything. Try to find where it matters most, it creates most value.
Right. Okay, good. So be strategically selective. Right, exactly. Where it has maximum impact. Annika, what advice would you give to a board or executive team?
I will give three things. One is to find the strategic value that ecosystem could, benefit you, and then look for a suitable model and find out, where in the organization would you start testing this kind of ecosystem? Is it your R&D? Is it your go-to-market? Where do you want to start? And find a suitable model. There are plenty of models out there already. And then create a narrative of your own future organization, and then align your top management team around this narrative. That is our future identity.
Right. Okay, good. So we're both of your responses were highly strategic. So let's start with the strategic why first, and let's dream big, start small, scale fast through experiment, kind of learn your way to the future. That's what I picked up. But the main thing is to have a strategic perspective here. Okay, so we have a couple minutes, so let me just wrap up. First off, fantastic dialogue to Mark and Annika. Thank you so much. Hats off. Really appreciate your generous investment time and your insightful commentary. We could probably continue this conversation for a week or two. It's a very rich topic. So to the participants, we had folks from all around the world, in India, South Africa, France. Thank you for being with us today. I really appreciate your generous investment time, and really appreciate it. Many thanks to Stuart and Thinkers50 and the HMI Model Institute. Thank you to Monica Kosman. She's behind the scenes producing this whole event with the technology. And so again, thanks. Very honored to be here. Very honored to share the stage with Mark and Annika. Thank you for everything. Have an amazing week. And I think we'll cut it from here.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.